Hi, Misha here, and one of the most interesting roles of a modern jet aircraft in the U.S. military, specifically the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy, also the Marines, is electronic warfare, which crosses over into attack, which becomes kind of SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, once called Wild Weasels, or if you were in the Navy, Iron Hand. So with that, I thought I'd lay out half a dozen different Hobbymaster 172 scale diecast models to kind of talk about the two roles, which really do cross over, especially in the Navy. And yeah, just kind of talk about, now that I've got a more or less complete set from beginning to end. Over here we have the early ones. We have the EA-6B Prowler. We have the F-105G Thunder Chief. And then we move into slightly newer stuff with the EF-111A Raven, sometimes called the Spark Vark, which is a cooler name in my opinion. Then we get to the F-4G, so-called Wild Weasel 5, which was the ultimate version of the Phantom Wild Weasel used throughout the 80s and 90s. And then it was replaced with the F-16CJ and then the updated CM variant, often called the Viper, even though official name would be the Fighting Falcon. And then finally, and most recent to my collection, we have the Navy's EA-18G Growler, a variant in the Super Hornet family. And these are all variants, updates of other existing aircraft, and it is interesting to see how they modified them for their individual roles. The story got started really with Vietnam and lasts to this very day, with some pretty big highlights throughout the Gulf War and the Second Iraqi War. So with that, let's just kind of do an overview and comparison of these. This will be a bit of a longer video, and this is me saying it, so settle in, get yourself a drink, and let's talk about electronic warfare, Wild Weasel, SEAD jet fighters, or in this case, fighter bombers. Get into it. We begin with Republic's F-105 Thunder Chief, but we all know it is the Thud. Much cooler name. And this first flew in 1955 and started off as a fighter bomber. It's more of a low altitude, supersonic penetration fighter bomber. The idea was to go in under radar and strike. It could carry about 14,000 pounds. Originally it had an internal bomb bay, and so on and so forth. Now the regular F-105 had a single seat cockpit, but there was the F-105F two-seater, initially developed for training. So our Wild Weasels here. Well, the idea behind Wild Weasels, Air Force code name, Navy called them Iron Hand, was to seek out and destroy enemy SAM sites, radar installations with guided missiles, or in some instances, radar-assisted anti-aircraft artillery installations. Also with electronic warfare, jamming and kind of messing with the enemy as a secondary role, as we'll see. And this all got started really back in the 1950s when the Navy worked on the first anti-radiation missile arm. And this would be developed initially by Texas Instruments and would become the Agm-44 Shrike, which first appeared in 1965 and first saw combat the next year. So in Korea, it was still kind of traditional visual range fighting, not a whole lot of electronic warfare going on, although some dated back, like chaff and whatnot, radar disruption and radio messing with to World War II. But in Vietnam, things changed. A lot had to do with the new SA-2 Soviet SAMs, also known as the telephone pole. This increased the threat dramatically to bombing raids and whatnot. Therefore, the Air Force would authorize the first Wild Weasels in 1965, and the Navy would kick off Iron Hand. The Navy would use initially the A-4, the Tonka, as a strike aircraft using what they had. But the Air Force wanted to go a little more specific. So the first Wild Weasel, WW-1, was the F-100F, the two-seat version of the Super Sabre. And it had early jamming pod and early radar detection equipment. But for offense, it basically just relied on iron bombs and unguided rockets. And they would first test these out at the end of 1965, but had very high attrition rates with the first generation of Wild Weasels, again, the Super Sabres. So they needed something better. They needed better equipment. They needed something better. The next step would be Wild Weasel 2, which was the EF-4C Phantom. And we're going to talk a lot more about the Phantom in a minute. But they were trying the F-4C variant, and they tried to fit it with quite a bit of new equipment. Jamming pod, radar detection, even some electronic countermeasures like noise generation pods and whatnot. But it didn't work well. The equipment interfered with each other. There wasn't enough space inside the airframe. If they hung it on the outside of the airframe, they had weight penalties and maneuverability and speed limitations. The aircraft frame wasn't up for it. The electronics were too big and bulky in 1966. So Wild Weasel 2 really never got much past the testing phase. Enter Wild Weasel 3. This is where they take the F-105F, and they would take 61 and upgrade them to be F-105Gs here. And the benefit of this, we have a lot more internal space. They were able to integrate a lot of the electronic equipment, jamming equipment, detection equipment inside the fuselage, back in the old bomb bay. This still left 5 hard points underneath. And again, this can carry about 14,000 pounds, so pretty good. And they go for the two-seat version, with the front seat being pilot, the second seat being the electronics officer, messing with all the equipment. And the Thud was well known for being a durable aircraft. It was also designed to be very fast at low altitude, so it could swoop in, and yeah, it wasn't limited. And it was pretty good size too. This is about 67 feet long, actually probably a little bit longer for the two-seater, and then pretty narrow at about 35 feet. And it was still supersonic. Had a pretty low max altitude of about 47,000 feet, but again, for Wild Weasel duties, how high are you really going to go? You need to draw this out. In fact, the program originally was named Ferret because it was going to ferret out SAM sites, get them to turn on their radars, reveal themselves, and detect, and then launch missiles. And the first anti-radiation missile, like I said, was the Agm-44 Shrike. But unfortunately, it had a way too picky sensor detector in the nose, somewhat limited range, and had a pretty low success rate early on. Now later they would make the 45B, which they corrected quite a few of the issues. But they were also working on another variant, which they would first try out in March of '68, which was the Agm-78 STARM, Standard Anti-Radiation Missile. And that's what's on this model here. In fact, it has 2 Shrikes and 2 STARMs. Now, the good about the STARM was It had a very good long range, longer than the SA-2 missile sights. It had a programmable seeker head, and it would course correct itself during flight, so it was a pretty advanced kit. Had a pretty big warhead, so it was a lot better than the Shrike. The problem, it was big and heavy. The thing was 15 feet long and weighed nearly 1,500 pounds each. That meant, yeah, planes like the F-105 could carry it, but many other aircraft simply could not. Size and weight just couldn't do it, especially with all the other equipment. Even here, we only see it carrying 2, again with 2 Shrikes as backup. It would also have the centerline fuel tank, well, because it needed it in range. So now we have 2 pieces of specialized equipment to attack SAM-site radars. And of course, there's a big cat and mouse game. Of the 60 some odd F-105Gs, around half of them were modified to fire the Agm-78. And then again, the more advanced Shrike would come about in a couple of years to kind of improve things a bit. So this was really the first truly effective Wild Weasel in the Air Force. And it would originally start off with about a 20% success rate with the storms, but this would increase. But even if it didn't hit its target, it would cause the enemy to turn off their radar, which would allow airstrikes and whatnot to proceed, basically fulfilling the purpose anyway. But they suffered high loss rates. The thuds did in general. They made about 850 some odd between 1955, but production had already ended in 1964 before Vietnam got going. So they had a limited number, many of them being the D, so they only had a few of the Fs, and many of them were already lost in combat. And again, electronics, well, that's progressing at a certain rate. So this was, if not something slapped together, it was always an interim solution, a stopgap measure. But it really became iconic because it took a couple of crazy mofos to pilot this thing. Because, well, a thud to begin with, and then literally dangling yourself in the air, hoping a radar would try to lock onto you, and then hoping you can shoot it down with very new but also very temperamental technology. Yeah, it took brave souls. And this is why, of course, it was always a volunteer system. So that was the Wild Weasel 3 in the Air Force. What about Wild Weasel 4 and 5? The F-4G, the Advanced Wild Weasel, or Wild Weasel number 5, Mark 5, however you like to say it. Going back, like I said, Wild Weasel 2 were some F-4Cs that were trialed out in 1966, but the technology just wasn't there. The space on the airframe wasn't there, and so they were abandoned in favor of the F-105G beginning in late 1967, and these saw heavy use in 1968 and 1969. But as they were lost or broke down without a production line up and going, they couldn't replace them. So, in March of 1969, it was decided to convert 36 F-4Cs to the Wild Weasel role, which would become Wild Weasel 4. And they use more advanced equipment, including the ALQ-119 ECM, the Electronic Countermeasures Pod, and they could use the updated Shrike missile, usually carrying 2, plus other typical weapons. And they would update the rear cruise station, basically just an update of the other. And these were reasonably successful. The First Wild Weasels were in Operation Rolling Thunder back in '65, but the F-105Gs and the EF-4Cs were used heavily in 1972 during a linebacker, and kind of made a name for themselves and kind of proved the maturing of the technology. In 1973, they were updated with even more advanced equipment, radar detection. And then in 1975, the first advanced Wild Weasel, number 5 here, flew. And this was based on all the lessons the U.S. had learned from Vietnam, plus what the Israelis had experienced with their own Phantoms during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and based on newer SAM technology like the SA-6. So first flew in '75 and started to enter squadron service in 1978, and these were basically F-4Es. Originally they were working with the F-4D, but they discovered that the F-4E was coming out, and it was better. It had leading edge wing slats, which allowed for better low-level maneuverability. It had more powerful engines, and they could remove the cannon, which they did, to free up internal space. It was just a better airframe. So the F-4G was an updated F-4E. Now some sources say 116 were converted, other sources say 134. So take your pick. But these were converts, and they entered into service in 78. This meant that in 1979, the existing Wild Weasel 4s were converted back to standard F-4Cs, and usually in National Air Guard service. So this would become the new standard in the 1980s. It would actually be organized into hunter-killer teams with F-16Cs. So you'd have a F-4G and an F-16C working in conjunction to ferret out SAM sites and then take them out. So what exactly is the F-4G here? Well, specs, of course, it's very similar. 63 feet long by about 38.5 foot wingspan. Maximum speed of over Mach 2. Ceiling of 60,000 feet. Can carry over 18,000 pounds. One nice thing about the F-4E, it had more internal fuel, which meant that the G could kind of rely on one centerline tank only. They usually put a larger tank on there, about a 600 gallon, freeing up the external hard points for air-to-surface ordnance and leaving the ones underneath for air defense Sparrows. Several different configurations and setups. One neat thing about the G, really for the first time, the rear seat for the electronics officer was really updated. They gave a lot more instrumentation, updated the layout. It was very customized for the role. So that made it more effective and easier to manage. Of course, it had detection equipment inside. The usual stuff you come to expect. Now they took, like I said, the cannon out and used that space. It relied on, at least the early Phantoms relied on the late style Agm-44 Shrike, but then they started having the Agm-88, the HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missile, as their standard. And this was and still is a very effective anti-radar missile. They also started carrying AIM-65 Mavericks. It's kind of an alternative thing in case they overshot a target. It kind of gave them an alternative ability. So those were the two primary air-to-surface munitions they carried. They could also alternatively carry AIM-9L Sidewinders for self-defense, as well as AIM-7 Sparrows under the fuselage. And this one here, this model's from the first Gulf War, and it's carrying 2 additional pods under the fuselage. We have an ALK, as my speech calls it, an ALQ 131, as well as an ALQ-184 for additional jamming and electronic countermeasure and defense. So lots of electronics in different times, and of course these would be updated as time would go on. So yeah, these would fly throughout the 1980s, and they would see heavy use during the 1991 Desert Storm campaign, and to be very effective at taking down the Iraqi SAM network, which was actually very intense. Turned out it was a bit of a paper tiger, but on paper it was a big threat. So these were pretty important. And only one F-4G was lost in Iraq. Luckily the crew ejected and were rescued by allies, so no problems there. And these would continue to fly in 1992, enforcing the no-fly zone over Iraqi airspace. And after the war, 2 squadrons would continue to operate the F-4G, Advanced Wild Weasel, finally retiring them in 1996. This was the last purpose-built SEAD aircraft. Originally Wild Weasel, later on, more modern times, SEAD, Suppression of Enemy Air Defense, would become a common term. This was kind of the last true custom purpose-built variant for that. It was also the last F-4 Phantom in U.S. Air Force service to see active, combat and deployment. So, last of a lot of things, and it really was a very advanced aircraft. It still couldn't carry the STARM, or at least it didn't, but it definitely gave a pretty good payload option. 2 or 4 air-to-surface pieces of ordnance. It could also carry cluster bombs and regular iron bombs too, if it needed to hit a more generalized target. And again, it can carry different pods in the front for offense or defense. And they would use these for electronic jamming and just kind of messing with the enemy's ability to focus its resources. Pretty neat. It's one of my kind of favorite models. And with that, we've talked about the Air Force for a good while, so let's check in with the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. The Grumman EA-6B Prowler, later Northrop Grumman. The Navy was also, of course, interested in electronic warfare and attack aircraft to protect their own ships, to support ground troops such as the Marine Corps. Of course, the Marines were kind of attached to all this too. And generally just to, mess with the enemy's electronics and what have you, also to get into a bit of surveillance. And the early effort would have been the EA-6A, which was a modified A6 intruder design, and they would have 27 for the Marine Corps. They do 12 actual conversions with 15 new builds, but this was just really a slightly updated, customized A6 intruder. And it was always an interim solution, stopgap, if you will. In late 1966, Grumman would be awarded a contract to develop a true purpose-built electronic attack aircraft. And they would begin with the same A6 intruder body, but they would give it a new front end, allowing for 1 pilot and 3 echoes, electronic countermeasures officers. They would also rewire it, allowing for various pods, including this one on the tail. And it would still have the 5 underwing hardpoints, and able to carry various jamming pods, electronic pods, chaff pods, fuel tanks, what have you. And the first prototype would fly in May of 1968. From that, they would continue working. It would take a little while because, again, this is electronics, pretty advanced stuff for the late 60s. And the first ones were handed over to the Navy in January of 1971. And they were first put on a ship for a cruise that summer. And by the next year, 2 squadrons would be operating off the coast over Vietnam and would be in time for late operations in that war, such as linebacker. And initially, this was pretty much an unarmed aircraft, although the ALQ-99 was considered its primary weapon. It's just a hair under 60 feet long with a 53-foot wingspan. This is very much a subsonic aircraft. It's only able to reach about 630 to 650 miles per hour, but it likes to cruise at 500 or less. It also, like a lot of naval aircraft, has a relatively low ceiling of about 37,000 feet. But it was the first purpose-built electronic warfare plane in the armed services. This wasn't considered a conversion. This was considered a separate new model from the A6 Intruder. And yeah, once they started to manufacture these, that let them retire the EA-6As after Vietnam. And ultimately they would build 170 used by the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps, and they were also later used to support U.S. Air Force operations and missions. And yeah, were a very effective piece of kit. They were used in 1983 during the invasion of Grenada. They were also used to mess with Libyan radar during Operation El Dorado Canyon in 1986, and 39 were used during the 1991 Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. So they're going strong and are a pretty well liked and respected aircraft. But much as the U.S. Air Force would update their Wild Weasels, going from 1 through 5, the Navy, and by extension the Marine Corps, would start updating their Prowlers in 1973. In 1973, XCAP, or Expanded Capability, was the first of many upgrades to the Prowler. This would give it wider, more diverse range of frequencies to scan and work with. It would quickly be followed on by the Improved Capability plan in 1976, which further modernized the ECM and just available equipment. And then Improved Capability Mark II came in 1980, and this was a pretty major update. In addition to updating the ECM again, it gave new displays to the crew. It also gave inertial navigation, and it allowed the Prowler to carry missiles for the first time. First, the Agm-44 Shrike, although these don't seem to really appear much because of when it came in, more frequently seen with the Agm-88 Harm. Although usually it would still carry pods. In fact, there was several configurations. This one here is a pretty common one with 3 ALK-99 pods and 2 fuel tanks. An alternative loadout would be take the fuel tanks off and put 2 Harm missiles on, so 3 pods and 2 harms. Beyond that, there's a loadout where they have a total of 5 pods, which is kind of extreme. On the other extreme, there's a loadout with only 1 pod, centerline, and 4 harm missiles. But this is pretty uncommon. I would either say this configuration with 2 tanks and 3 pods, or the 2 missiles and 3 pods are the 2 main configurations. So yeah, it would continue to be expanded. As it's getting up in years after the Gulf War in the 1990s, back in 95, there was a big program to expand, again, the capability, including a new update to the airframe, and they actually made a couple of prototypes, but it did not come to be. So that program was canceled. Nevertheless, in 2001, at the beginning of the so-called War on Terror, there were nearly 130 of these still in U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps service, and they were used quite actively in Afghanistan and Iraq. Even though they were aging, they were still viable, and they did their best to keep them up to date. By the way, if the canopy on this is kind of yellowish in color on the camera, that is intentional. They had kind of a yellowish gold tint. This was not only to help kind of keep down glare for the crew, but also to help kind of minimize emissions from the cockpit, not to interfere. And by this point, sometimes they would only fly with a crew of 3, taking out one of the echoes in the back. Funnily enough, to keep the ejection system working properly, they had to replace him with ballast of some type that weighed about the same as a person. I don't know why they found that funny. So yeah, going in, the Prowler is still very much viable. In fact, because of what happened in the Air Force in '98, there started to even be some Air Force crew serving in the backs of these. In 2009, its replacement started to come around, but these are still very much in service. In fact, the Improved Capability Mark III program was started, and the elements began to be delivered in 2010. Essentially, this was an expansion of the ECM, and it had some new capabilities, new pods. By now, they're sometimes using the ALQ 218 pods. So basically improving its defense capability and electronics abilities. And this was the final version that was used. The Navy planned to retire theirs by 2015, and so the last Prowlers would go on a cruise beginning in November of 2014, and then would be retired the next year in a big ceremony. But the Marine Corps would continue to use theirs. In fact, they used them quite a bit, beginning in 2016 over Syria. They would use them as a command and control plane, again, because we do have 4 on board. They would also use it in its reconnaissance, aka spying role, more listening in on enemy communications and what have you, traffic. And they would use it with the harm missiles to take out enemy SAM sites and just generally mess with their defense network and systems. So it's very much an active use in the Marine Corps throughout 2017. And then in 2018, even the Marines were getting ready to retire their Prowlers, which they officially did in March of 2019. So a very good service life of nearly 50 years. Very good for an electronics craft. By the way, this in front of the cockpit here is supposed to be bent over. That's intentional. That's the Refueling Probe. It's a neat model. It's a really interesting plane. And I say that I've always been a big fan of the A6 Intruder, so this is like a bigger Intruder. And so, yeah, it did have the ground attack capability, but it was only added later in life. This was primarily an electronics jamming and support craft, and it was used to support other naval craft. And again, before this, they mostly relied on the A-4 during Operation Iron Hand. They also outfitted A-6s as effectively wild weasel type craft. So now we have to check back in with the Air Force, because now Grumman's gonna give them a hand. The U.S. Air Force's EF-111A Raven. Very interesting aircraft. These were not new production. They were all modified from existing F-111A aardvarks. So they had the same basic dimensions, very long at 76 feet, and with the wings folded in, only 32 feet, but when they get spread out, we have a span of up to 63 feet. And this was a dedicated electronic warfare plane. It was not ever equipped with anti-radiation missiles. For that, the Air Force operated the Wild Weasels. But the Wild Weasels didn't have much in the way of intelligence gathering, pretty basic jamming, and not much in the way of coordination. So beginning in the 1960s, the Air Force was looking to replace its aging fleet of EB-57s, which was the electronic surveillance variant of the Canberra, and the EB-66 destroyer. And they did look at the EA-6B Prowler that the Navy was developing at the time, but they decided it wasn't to their needs. The Prowler, while a good aircraft, was pretty slow, and the Air Force wanted a penetration aircraft capable of supersonic speeds, able to dash into enemy lines and, whatnot. So basically use speed as its main defense. Now the whole General Dynamics F-111, that's a story in and of itself, for sure. But they basically decided to look at modifying these for their needs. And in 1974, General Dynamics and Grumman were kind of asked to submit their plans for converting the aardvark into an electronics plane. And at the end of that year, Grumman was declared the primary contractor, and they would get a contract to convert 2 in early 1975. At this time, the program is known as the Electric Fox, which is a cooler name than Raven, in my opinion. And so they would work on that, and the first one would fly in 1977. And the first one would be given over to Air Force Squadron in November of 1981, reaching initial operational readiness in 1983. So what do we have here? Well, like the aardvark, this is a very fast aircraft, twin engine. It's capable of reaching speeds of Mach 2.2 with a maximum altitude of over 45,000 feet. Twin engine. It has a 2-person cockpit, but whereas before you basically had a pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, now the pilot is the only one who flies it, and the second seat is strictly speaking for an EWO, an electronic warfare officer. So the seats, the positions are more dedicated, rearranged. It uses much of the same systems as the original. In place of the bomb bay, it now carries a bunch of equipment, electronic equipment. And on the back here you can see this pod on the tail. It actually uses a variant of the same jamming and electronics countermeasure system as the Navy, the ALQ-99E, ALQ-99E, as well as several other pieces of equipment. It's about 6,000 pounds worth of electronics, but of course keep in mind this is 1970s electronics, so you know, it's about like what's probably in your iPhone today. So this is a high speed, deep penetration electronics craft designed to support other craft operating in the area. And they would go on station to provide intel for F-16s, F-15s, A-10 Warthogs even, as well as just mess with the enemy's equipment and ability to communicate. So pretty good. They would get to see combat for the first time in 1986, Operation El Dorado Canyon over Libya. And then again, they would be used over Panama in 1989. Now the Air Force would have 42 of these converted. The work done by Grumman between 1977 and 1985 when the last one was delivered. And beginning in the late 80s, there was a major update program for many of their systems. Not just the ECM, but also the cockpit, the displays, the radar, what have you. These would, of course, continue to serve during the Gulf War, and had a very good track record. While an EF-111 was on station providing support, no friendly aircraft was lost under its protection. So, good sheepdog, good raven. During the war, there's kind of an apocryphal account of one of these actually getting a kill by forcing an Iraqi Mirage F-1 to maneuver away and crash into the ground. Some people, party poopers, want to point out this probably didn't happen, but either way, it's a fun story. Now, one EF-111 was lost on, I believe it was February 17 during the war. Unfortunately, the crew did not survive, but the good news is that was the only Raven lost in Iraq. And throughout their entire service, only 3 were lost to other causes, so a total of 3, so 2 to other causes, I should have said. And they were continued to upgrade and update these through 1993, 1994. They would continue to be stationed in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, enforcing the no-fly zone. They would also operate in various hotspots, not just strictly speaking for warfare, but you had Operation Provide Comfort, for example, where they would be more of a humanitarian guys. And as I said at the beginning, the aircraft can have 2 fuel tanks, one under each wing. I just don't have them on this model because they kind of get in the way and they like to fall off. Kind of annoying. But it is a good use of the Air Force's aardvarks, which, yeah, again, had the kind of their own rocky thing. And it provided the Air Force with a very good companion to their F-4 Gs. One's on one end of the spectrum, one's on the other. And it was more to the Air Force's liking vis-a-vis the Navy's Prowlers. But because of budget cuts, these were retired early. They started to be retired overseas in the spring of 1998, and then the last ones were retired stateside in May of that year. So even before the end of the 20th century, the Ravens were pulled from service. Some of them only serving 13 years, and the oldest ones serving not even 20. So it seems a little premature. In fact, it's something the Air Force would later kind of lament, because it left them without an electronics aircraft electronic warfare, which when it came to gathering intel and whatnot was kind of important. And this is when the Air Force started kind of operating joint squadrons subordinate to the U.S. Navy, putting some of their own EWOs, ECOs on board Navy planes. Because, yeah, the Prowler, even though it was older than the Raven, would fly for another decade plus in the Navy and 2 more decades in the Marine Corps. But, yeah, it is what it is. And with that, let's move in to the 21st century. The F-4G really was the last custom variant for wild weaseling. And its kind of heyday was the Gulf War. Because as it was serving in the Middle East, its replacement was kind of finishing up. And actually, the first of these was delivered to the Air Force in 1991. This is, of course, the F-16, specifically the F-16CJ variant. These could be either Block 50 or 52 aircraft. So the latest and greatest at the time. And these really aren't terribly different from our standard C. And like I said, in the 80s, the F-16 and F-4G worked together. But with the introduction of the CJ, they would begin taking over the role. The first squadron would be operationally ready in 94, and in 96 they would kind of get the final update to put them into full service. This would be to the computers, the multi-function displays, digital recorders, that kind of stuff, kind of the final thing. And this is what allowed the wild weasels, the F-4Gs, to be pulled out. And they would continue using the wild weasel name on these, at least informally, even sometimes called wild weasel 6s. So this is your basic F-16 airframe, about 49.5 feet long, wingspan of 32.5 feet, capable of achieving Mach 2 when clean, or at least Mach 1.6 to 1.8 loaded down. Max altitude of over 50,000 feet. Several hard points, although some are specialized, like under the fuselage. And able to carry up to 17,000 pounds. It's a true multi-role aircraft. Now, one thing that's interesting, there is, of course, a 2-seat F-16, and always has been, and not just for training. There are combat versions. But for this, they actually went with the C model, which is a single seat. And some criticize this, getting rid of the Echo, or the EWO, in the back, saying, you know, you need 2 crew for this. And by now, the SEAD name is being used officially. But other people say that, you know, modern computers, modern display systems, automation means that one person can do the job. And keep in mind that, you know, you're not endangering 2 people per craft. And what is still today a very risky maneuver. Yeah, so there you go. And these are typically operate in groups of 4. Kind of 2 and 2. And so what makes this different? Well, it carries the Agm-88 harm, typically 2, but it can carry up to 4. It can also carry the Agm-44 Shrike. Sometimes they'll carry 2 of those and 2 harms, although again not frequently. It can also carry the Agm-44 Harpoon anti-shipping missile, In fact, the Block 50-52 series is the first F-16 to be able to do this. So it has a good amount of ordnance. It does have updates to its computer system, hardware and software. And then it has the HTS, which is the Harm Targeting Systems pod under the fuselage, the small one there. And in addition to that, it has a Laser Ranger targeting pod. And in the center line, it usually carries a jammer pod for self-defense. And that's what makes up the Wild Weasel version. This one here has 2 fuel tanks for range, and then it has a couple of sidewinders for self-defense. Sometimes the wingtip rails are left empty because of weight, but other times they can have either sidewinders or even AMRAAMs, AIM-120s for defense. And also this does retain the cannon as far as I know. And yeah, this went into service after the Gulf War, allowing the older F-4G to be retired. And so they started to see active use in the late 90s and were available for Afghanistan, the Second Iraq War. And then in 2005, they had a pretty big update. This would be when they would transition from the F-16CJ to the F-16CM. And the big thing, they had Link 16, a new data link system that required rearranging the pods a bit. They would also update a few bits and bobs on the aircraft. And by the way, late service Prowlers would also have the Link 16 system. I can't talk now apparently. Link 16 system. So they're using the same, and this allows different aircraft to communicate and coordinate, thus further easing the duties on the pilot. And they continued to serve. They were used in Operation Odyssey Dawn in 2011 to great effect, and have been used in Afghanistan, Iraq, and more recently Syria. And there are several specialized squadrons around the world that fly these. Often they do acquire the name Viper, which is something that's been applied to the F-16 since its very beginning, unofficially. And this is the current Wild Weasel, essentially an F-16 fitted out with the appropriate kit and an updated computer system. It's also worth pointing out that in the Air Force today, some F-15Es, as well as even some A-10s, kind of take on the suppression of enemy air defense role, essentially hitting missile and radar sites. And even some of the newer F-35 Lightnings are beginning to take over this role. But the F-16CM is still kind of the main thing, at least for the time being. But it is kind of sad that we've gotten away from specialized Wild Weasels. That said, this is actually one of my favorite models, and probably my favorite of my F-16s. I just think it looks neat and interesting, different with its configuration and alternative layout. So that's what the Air Force is up to. But what about the Navy and the Marines? And we end with one I looked at quite recently, the Boeing EA-18G Growler. This is ultimately what the Navy would replace the Prowler with. The Prowler used the ALK 99, as well as later versions using the ALK 218. And even the last refit update gave it the Link 16 system. So they did what they could, but this was still a subsonic aircraft, and it only had 5 hardpoints available, even though it could lift 18,000 some odd pounds. The Growler is a heavy modification of the FA-18F Super Hornet. This goes all the way back to 2001 when Boeing did a test flight of a modified Super Hornet with the ALK 99 system fitted, and this led to a production contract at the end of 2003 for them to develop and have some prototypes ready. The first of those flying in August of 2006, and they would make a total of 5. And the first aircraft, at least production models, would be delivered to the Navy in the summer of 2008 and would be operationally pretty much done with testing, including carrier landings, by the end of summer 2009, and the first squadron available for deployment at the end of that year, although they'd only reached initial operational readiness, not full operational readiness. That would not come until some more computer software and tech updates. But by the end of 2011, the new Growler was declared fully operational. And, size-wise, this isn't much larger than the F-16. It's just over 60 feet long, and it has a wingspan, including the pods on the tips, of a bit under 45 feet. Each of the wingtips has the ALK 218 pod on it. And then under each wing, there's a ALK 99 pod. And then there's a low band 99 pod on the center line. And to kind of control all this, the place where the 20mm cannon used to be, that spot has been taken over by computer systems and just centrally a box for everything to kind of be wired through and to communicate. And likewise, the back seat is fully dedicated to the electronic warfare officer and all his needs. He's got full multifunction color displays. Now, much as they criticize the F-16CJ going to single person, the fact that the Growler only has 2, and it was replacing an aircraft that had 4, even though sometimes there was only 3 on board, they thought that 2 people may not be enough, would be a heavier workload. But again, modern displays, layouts, touchscreen technology, off-bore sight, helmets, all this stuff just it makes it where 2 people can do the jobs that once required 4. Even if maybe a little extra work. So yeah, the wingtip rails are taken up by jammer pods. Generally speaking, this is nearly the same airframe as the FA-18F, but it's only about 90% the same. They did change the leading edge, and they added some wing fences. They changed the hinges at Boeing to give it a little better maneuverability, because all these pods do slow it down. The Super Hornet has a max speed of Mach 1.8. The Growler is slowed down to about Mach 1.6. Still has an altitude of 50,000 feet though, and still can lift about 17,000 pounds. So it's a little less of a payload than the Prowler. That also has a little less range than the Prowler, but it's much faster and it has more attachment points underneath than the Prowler. And of course, it's just much more modern technology. The Prowler was getting to the point where it just couldn't keep getting updated. And to be fair, this is a smaller aircraft too, so it takes up less space on a aircraft carrier, and it lets them do their whole all Hornet fleet thing they wanted to do. And quite an interesting craft. Now that's the E part of the thing, so that's the electronics part, and there is definitely a configuration where it would just carry pods and fuel tanks for passive surveillance, spying if you will. But in more of a strike role or escort role, it typically will carry 2 HARM missiles, Agm-88s, one under each wing. Also, almost all the time, it'll carry 2 AMRAAMs under the fuselage, AIM-120s, just for self-defense. So they're medium-range missiles. Typically, it will not carry AIM-9 Sidewinders, although the Australian variant does. And that's the strike role. It can carry 4 HARM missiles, but this doesn't seem to hardly, if ever, be deployed. 2 seems to be where it's at. And the idea is it can, quote-unquote, escort itself thanks to the AMRAAMs and speed, whereas the old Prowler, yeah, it could carry HARMs, but that was it. It really couldn't carry air-to-air missiles for self-defense. So that's one other benefit to the Growler. These were first deployed during Operation Odyssey Dawn over Libya to help disrupt the enemy's communication and radar. 5 were deployed there. By the way, one neat ability of the Growler, it can jam enemy communications while actually allowing friendly communications. Kind of a good thing to be able to talk while your enemy can't. Whereas the older Prowlers, they could jam comms, but they would also jam friendly comms too if they did so. And since 2011, these have continued to be deployed. They were authorized for full rate production in 2009. They would continue to deliver them. The Navy has continued to, put in orders, and to date, the Navy has about 140 in service. And with the retirement of their Prowlers in 2019, the Marine Corps can also call upon the Growler. Because Growler and Prowler sound so similar on the radio, these are referred to as Grizzlies. And it's a neat aircraft, a neat model. And has had a pretty good run. Pretty trouble-free as far as it goes. That's kind of the benefit of basing it on the Hornet and Super Hornet tried and true airframe. And it's probably the most advanced electronic attack aircraft in the world today. Certainly one of the most advanced. And the Air Force does station some EWOs to operate in the back seats of these. Some years ago they had 40 some odd. Today I think the number's a little higher. So some Growlers, usually the ones based off on land, on shore bases, tend to be joint crews of Navy and Air Force in some instances because, yeah, they still don't have a electronic aircraft in and of itself. The F-16CM is a very good wild weaseler, but its ability to really act as an electronic warfare aircraft is very minimal, whereas this pretty much sways a little bit towards the other direction. Yeah, it can be a strike aircraft, an attack aircraft, but its primary mission still seems to be electronic, which is neat. And that's what the Navy is rolling with today. The only other user is the Royal Australian Air Force that has 11 now. They had 12, but they lost one in an accident. And of the aircraft in this video, that's really about the only foreign user. Most all of these have been U.S. military versions only. Although, to be fair, the Israelis have had their own kind of versions of wild weasels after their experience in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And again, I've covered certainly these two quite recently in their own videos if you'd like to hear more. I just thought it would be fun to do a dedicated electronics video because they're pretty neat aircraft. And so these are the two currently in frontline service. Well, let's get them all back out for some final thoughts. And there we have it, folks. The 105G kind of paved the way, and from there we got the first true dedicated electronic aircraft. Although of course it was based on the A6, it was its own design. And then we move in to modifying the F-111s into the EF-111s that served the Air Force for a couple of decades. And while on the table this is one of the only ones that was not armed itself, it still provided a key part in the whole SEAD and electronic disruption role, so it has to be mentioned. Plus it still uses the ALC 99. And then of course we get into the Phantom, which really got the Wild Weasel going, and for a long time was the best and really was the last true dedicated variant, because when we get to the F-16CJ and CM, while these do have special equipment and are a variant, they are essentially standard F-16s. And this would be the first one to have a single-person crew as well. And then for the Navy, of course the F-16 being Air Force, they retain the two-person crew and a dedicated airframe. Now, yeah, the EA-18 Growler is 90% compatible, 90% the same as a regular FA-18F Super Hornet, but that 10% plus the extra equipment under the wings really does kind of make the difference. And these are only coming into service and really kind of do both roles, hence the EA in the name. And you can tell the Navy and Air Force, well, they had similar goals. They did have different, I don't know, sub-objectives, the way they conducted themselves. And of course the Navy craft had to operate from carriers, which provides some interesting. But yeah, I just think it's a very unique role, something that really couldn't come about until the age of surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided artillery. It's also a role for very brave and very intelligent people, because these tend to be among the most advanced pieces of hardware of their era. And this is really something the U.S. has led the way in. Yeah, Europe had the Tornado, but Russia hasn't ever really done a lot with dedicated electronic warfare craft, although they have some. China is only recently starting to get into it with variants of the J-16. So this has kind of been the purview of the USA for over 50 years now, coming up on 60 pretty soon. And that's why I thought doing a kind of tribute and comparison video would be fun. Again, these are all Hobby Master 172 scale die-cast. They have the usual Hobby Master features: canopy open close, crew figures in or out, gears up or down, and ordnance on or off, and usually they come with different ordnance layouts too. The F-4 and the F-16 are on the alternative stands, so I can have the center line station open for stuff. And luckily, the way the stand fits the EA-18, you can still have the center line ALQ pod on there. And Luckily for the F-105G and EA-6B, they do kind of the pass-through stand that goes into the center line device. So we still have our pods, because that's kind of what these were. They needed fuel and pods, and sometimes missiles. And the EAF-111, the Raven, it does come with fuel tanks for the wings that can rotate, but they kind of get in the way, so they're not on. Yeah, nice models, and they do a lot of interesting stuff with U.S. military. Not always so much with foreign military. For that, you have Corgi. That's why usually you see Corgis in those British and German videos. But anyway, guys, I'm getting tired, so I appreciate you hanging out with me. Let me know what you think. Do you like the Navy style or the Air Force? And which is kind of your favorite? Let me know in the comments, and we can have a discussion about the Weasels down below. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And I'll catch you very soon next time.